To begin our morning plenary, From Fear to Fierce, centering immigrant voices and building cross-movement solidarity, please welcome our moderator, the Vice President of Philanthropic Practice at Hispanics in Philanthropy, Hilda Vega.
How is everyone doing today? Let's give another round of applause for Rudy and for Jeff Chavez and Paula Ramos. We're so grateful for them to set the stage for us. And obviously, of course, eternal gratitude to Dolores Huerta. Thank you all for being here with us this morning. I am really honored to be here and be able to continue this conversation that we're having about justice and rights, and especially our right to mobility and to be and live and have lives where we want to be. And I'm so excited to be able to bring out our speakers for this morning. We have, glasses time, we have T. Gonzalez, Lilian Aponte, Vanessa Cárdenas, and Shayna Aber. So probably like many of you, I have been struggling with how to feel in this moment and how to react and respond to everything that has been going on, not just this past weekend, but frankly for the past few years, maybe the past few decades. I've been around for a while. And when I was thinking about this session, I found some writing by Cherie Teng. For anyone who knows her, she is an activist and a leadership coach out in the Bay Area. And she wrote something that really kind of hit in that moment when I was kind of struggling with how to start this conversation. And she said, we have a choice, even in this hellscape, to stay in our humanness, to stand in our bigness, and to love courageously. And I think that this is really important in this moment, and to continue some of the thoughts that Rudy brought up about courage, and most importantly, the kinds of choices that we have right now that we are confronting and that we have the power to make. So I'm really excited for this group of folks to be able to pull the threads of all of these conversations together, because we're not just talking about immigration. At the core of it, it's an issue that is being used to divide and to create silos and to build up anger. And what we're really talking about is, in fact, our humanness, but also values and what is at the core of our democracy. So how do we make sure that we don't let everything that's happening right now divide us, but really use it as a moment to reflect, to think about our history, to think about narrative, and then really talk about the opportunities and the choices that we have in front of us, especially those of us in this room, in the nonprofit space, and especially in the philanthropic space. Teague, I'm going to turn to you first. You're here in New Mexico. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your work, but also your thoughts on what brought us to this moment.
Thank you so much. My name is T. Gonzalez. I am the Deputy Director at the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. We are the provider of statewide legal services in New Mexico for immigrants. And we also engage in systemic advocacy. We are a small state of about 2 million people. We have offices in Albuquerque, Las Cruces, and Santa Fe. Last year, we served around 10,000 people in 27 of our state's 33 counties. And we also provide weekly services inside our state's 3 detention centers. There are 3 ICE detention centers here in New Mexico, 2 within an hour of Albuquerque, 1 west and 1 to the east. And I also want to say that LA is in the room. I know that there are many people here from LA, but LA is also in our detention centers. 25 of the car wash workers who were detained in LA are in our detention centers. They are with us here in this space, in our minds, in our centers, in our state, and in this room. And I think what we're seeing is immigration is being used as a wedge issue to remove a set of constitutional rights for us all, with the spectacle and use of military force in our city streets. What we are seeing in Los Angeles is what we are going to see all over the country. There is $75 billion in the budget bill to expand interior enforcement operations and $45 billion for new and expanded detention centers. The time to prepare is now, and that's what we're doing in New Mexico. We are preparing to scale up a legal infrastructure network to meet the moment. That's what we're seeing. Though Rudy hearkened to what's happening in Los Angeles and in other cities, we've also seen an uptick in ICE activity here in New Mexico. We went from 1 to 6 ICE operations to 3 weeks ago, scaling up to 20 a week, which is a lot for New Mexico. The other thing that we're seeing right now, I think, is the largest assault on administrative due process rights in modern history. The administration is testing whether the protections of administrative law will be protected. And they're testing that with immigrants first. I think it's really important to understand that immigrants are at the tip of that spear. And if they are successful in that space, they will move to other populations, whether it's workers or Social Security or healthcare. That same bill is going to potentially eliminate or kick 10 million people off of Medicaid. Every single one of those people has a right to file an appeal in an administrative hearing process, and those due process protections that they want to be able to rely on to preserve their life-saving health care, we're working to protect that in the immigration space too, because if we can hold the line and make sure that those rights are protected for immigrants in New Mexico and in all of our states, then we are doing that for everyone. So what does a win look like in an administrative law process in these times? It's like in any authoritarian regime in history, we have to work to slow the machine down. So it's filing immigration applications, it's getting into the courts, it's working with our federal judicial partners, it's making sure that we do anything we can to slow the machine down, because we need to hunker down and we need to get through the next 15 months. We don't know what's going to happen in the midterms, but if things go well for one party, then we will see an increase in budgets or a decrease in ICE budgets. So I think it's really important to think about what's essential now to guard against the descent into authoritarianism. There are not enough immigration courts and there are not enough immigration judges to process all of the immigration applications that we could file. So we need to think about what we can do now to give people the best chance possible to have their right to remain. And we're building that here in New Mexico.
And Teague, I want to come back later on in the conversation I really like this phrase of slow the machine, and to make sure that we're sort of keeping these elements in mind. But I want to turn now to Lilian to help us scope out a little bit and continue this conversation around the history of what we need to know and understand, but also then kind of how do we use that history to help us continue to focus on power.
First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you for showing up in this moment. Thank you for being in a space where you're willing to build knowledge, where you're willing to build solidarity, where you're willing to be in community. And as we sit together in this moment and we look out at what is happening, it is sometimes difficult to put all the pieces together, to understand why this moment in particular requires that we show up the way that we're showing up, with the urgency that we're showing up for our communities. Because there are multiple things happening at once that are a threat to our immigrant communities and also to our constitutional democracy and to fundamental values and principles of due process and also shared humanity. And so when we're looking out in the world right now, we're seeing three things happen at once. We're seeing the externalization of migration beyond our borders, beyond the eyes and ears of the humanitarian organizations and legal organizations that can sound the alarm. At the same time that we're seeing that, we're seeing the interior targeting of our immigrant communities. And we're seeing the ways in which that interior targeting is being done through a mass machinery, and it's also being obscured from sight in our detention facilities and in places where people have little access, and now are having less access, even in public court hearings. Even our courts right now are now allowing our eyes and ears. And in the midst of that, we are also seeing simultaneously a dismantling of the network of advocates and of legal organizations that have been guardrails for looking at what's happening and also holding the government accountable. And all of those things are happening at once. And so in our community, in Arizona, where we serve adults and children in immigration detention, here is what we're seeing. We are seeing our detention centers right now filled up. Through interior enforcement, we are seeing people in detention being fast-tracked to court proceedings without any meaningful access to counsel, legal education. We are seeing ICE raids happening in our courthouses, where people who are showing up for their court hearings are being arrested at their court hearings. In our children's world, we are seeing family separation by other means. Make no mistake, family separation is still happening. Make no mistake, family separation is still happening, not only in the raids and in the separation of mothers and fathers from children, but also in the ways that the system has taken an administrative red tape approach to keeping children from their loved ones, through the requirements of having a certain type of documentation that is impossible to get. We are also seeing the government deploy intimidation tactics aimed at children through the pretext of what's being called wellness visits to ensure that children are presumably safe. And this looks like Homeland Security investigations officers knocking on the doors of families, coming unidentified, sometimes masked, sometimes with weapons, and asking to ensure that the children are safe as a pretext because the government knows where the children are. And in the midst of all that, we are also seeing the way that children are being fast-tracked through their own deportation proceedings. And at the same time that all that is happening, there has been an intentional and targeted attack at the network of advocates and providers who have been there for decades as guardrails to protect the due process and human rights of our immigrant communities. And that looks like the elimination of the funding that is necessary in order to carry out that labor every single day. And so our organizations right now, too, in this space, are needing to show up for our communities and for our communities of people who are doing the work, too. And so in the midst of all of this, and as we look out there, we know that there's an underpinning of this in a narrative that has been permeated into our national consciousness that dehumanizes, that criminalizes, and that misinforms. And we also know that this has a history, and that we have a problematized history, right? Starting with colonization and the dispossession of lands, also then having to do with systemic racism, xenophobia, and systems of exclusion. And we have to look at it. We have to look at what's happening now, and we have to also name the underpinnings of why we may be where we are now, and we also have to take the opportunity in the moment that we're in now to ask what it is ours to do. What is it ours to do, and how are we seeing communities show up right now in rapid response networks, in the fight that legal service providers are doing right now to stay alive in this moment and to also resource themselves, and what is it also the philanthropic communities to do? And so an invitation to partnership around that.
Yeah.
I want to pull a few of the threads that you mentioned in terms of narrative, but then also I want us all to remember that a few years ago, we could all count on talking about the protection and care of our children as an issue that brought people together. And now that is not holding true anymore. And so I want to invite in Vanessa to talk about the importance of narrative and how we can continue to claim and reclaim the power of narrative for our stories and our work.
Thank you so much, Hilda. And buenos días a todos. Can you guys hear me? Okay. No? Okay. How about now? There you go. Buenos días. My name is Vanessa Cárdenas, and I'm ED at America's Voice. We are a pro-immigration advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. And when we were founded, we were known as the communications arm of the movement. Since we were founded, things have changed, and the movement has grown, and now we have really incredible powerhouses in terms of immigration advocacy that have communications capacity, both at the national as well as the state level. So we continue to do our work. But as we all know, the narrative has been a big problem for us, not just in this last election cycle, but it's been building up for a couple of years. And I want to give you first a statistic just to put things into context. In the last election cycle, the right wing spent over $1 billion on anti-immigration ads. So just to put things into context, that the reason we're here today is a combination of a multi-year, multi-million-dollar strategy to be at this point. And also this week is the 10-year anniversary of when Trump came down those escalators to announce he was running for president. So the point that I'm trying to make is that Trump is a symptom. He's not the cause. So we have to understand that we are in this fight for the long run, and that even if when he runs again, he doesn't get to the White House, we still have this issue that we need to define and take back our narrative on who immigrants are and the place that immigrants have in this country, not just today, also for the future. And I just want to say that a lot has been said already by this wonderful panel, as well as Paula Ramos on the previous conversation about the narrative and where we are and how do we move forward. I do want to underscore that things are shifting, and that's really great news for us. The last couple of polls, nationwide polls, shows that the majority of Americans now disapprove of Trump. Some polls show that 52% of Americans disapprove of Trump when it comes to immigration, particularly because of what we have seen in LA. And among independents, that number goes up to 62%. So that is good news. We're seeing that people are seeing the impacts of mass deportation. And we also kind of anticipated that because, again, at least from our perspective, the mass deportation slogan was a mirage, because we knew that the more Americans see the real human and economic impact of immigration, the less they will like it. So we're seeing that. And I think it's really important for us to understand that that is an important path forward. We have to talk about the impacts in our neighbors, in our communities, in our coworkers, because that is actually something that's really powerful for us. I think the other point that I want to make, and again, my co-panelists spoke about this, is the rule of law and the fundamental rights of Americans. And what Americans are seeing, and it's becoming real life, is that we are seeing that fundamental rights like due process are being threatened. And we saw that with the Kilmer Abrego Garcia case. And we found that the more people learn about the case, of course, the more support there was for the Abrego Garcia family. So again, that goes to the point that we have to really uplift those stories in our communities to shift public opinion. The other piece I want to speak about is about solutions. And based on the polling that we have seen across the board, we know that most Americans are not anti-immigrant. They're anti-chaos. And the right wing has really taken advantage of this notion that our system is broken and chaotic. So part of what we need to do, and this is going to be a little hard for some of us, is articulate what we're for. Because as we know, it's not enough to say what we're against, but we're also going to have to say what we're for in terms of our immigration system. What we're for in terms of who do we want to legalize in this country, what we're for in terms of what our asylum system needs to look like, and also how are we going to manage the future flows of migration. Because the reality is that migration is going to continue happening in our hemisphere. So those are important questions that we need to think about the future. So the last thing I will say is that, and I am really looking forward to your questions, is that at the end of the day, the conversation around immigration is a public opinion battle. And we have to also see it as that. That's why all of us now have to become communicators. And we have to talk about the effect in our communities. We have to talk about how this relates to the broader conversation about American rights and freedoms. We have to talk about solutions. And the last piece, and I really want to emphasize this, we have to do more about defining who immigrants are, because 90% of the time we're spending on countering what the other side is saying. And we also have to have an affirmative vision of who our community is, who are immigrants in our community, the benefits of migration, and again, our solutions. And I think if we do that, that is going to help us in moving away from this system that is really hurting our communities and every American. So thank you.
So, Shana, and people who have heard me say this before, please forgive me. This is a particular drum I like to bang. But I frequently these days think a lot about the fact that we are living in a scenario that other people built out, paid for, designed 50, 60 years ago. So help us reclaim our history and also help us start to think about the different ways, and we'll come back to this, of where we can start to think deeply about solutions and tactics.
Yeah, okay, mic is on. So my name is Shana Aber. I am the executive director of the Acacia Center for Justice, which has the privilege of working with legal services organizations all around the country, coordinating, tracking trends, doing peer-to-peer learning, and funding, handling funds and distributing them as needed for the legal services community. But on a more personal level, I'm a movement baby. My dad was one of more than 1,000 young people who were called by the Student Nonviolent Organizing Committee and the Leadership Conference and the Black churches in 1964 to go down to Mississippi and to support the right of disenfranchised Black Americans to vote. That effort happened at one of the grimmest, most unprecedented, violent times in our nation's history. 1954, the wetback raids. 1955, Emmett Till's lynching. The turning of fire hydrants and hoses on people who were simply trying to exercise their civil rights and be part of this American fabric, have their voices heard. And Ella Baker, who was really kind of the genesis of this idea of recruiting mostly white young people to go down to the South to participate in enfranchising Black Americans in Mississippi and to witnessing the violent oppression of the sharecropper system, she had in her mind, we're not just going to work to register people to vote. We're not just going to accompany people to the polls to pass their poll taxes or poll tests. We are also going to train these young people to tell the story, to witness what they are seeing. And as a little girl, there was a book of all of the letters that were compiled by those civil rights workers that summer that my dad had a copy of in the house. And 3 of my dad's letters were in that book. And I remember going and reading the letters and thinking how dry they sounded to me, right? Because they were recounting step by step all of the ways in which people were being disenfranchised, all of the dehumanization and the attacks that people were suffering. But these were letters that were written home to pastors, to parents, to teachers, and it was part of a concerted effort of public consciousness building. And out of that summer, out of the horror of the summer, out of the murder of 3 civil rights workers that was orchestrated by law enforcement and the Klan, came such a moment of public outrage that when Congress came back to session, we got the Voting Rights Act. 1965, we got Hart-Celler, right? Which remade our immigration system, dispensed with the racial quota system that had been enshrining into our laws the demographic makeup of our country, and the disenfranchisement, especially of people from the Western Hemisphere who were coming here, just as other people were coming from Europe. And so as we are seeing what is happening today, let's be grounded in the history of social movements and what works. I've been thinking a lot about how to invite people who are not in the immigration movement into our sphere. Because this is a moment not just of suffering and trauma and fear, but of opportunity, because people are awake now. And we need people at the courthouses. We need people to witness these disappearances. We need people to know what is happening. And we need to be able to uplift the voices while centering the voices of people who are bearing the brunt of this, also uplift the voices of people who say, not in my America, not in my name. I am not going back 50 years.
I love that, thank you. Let's all keep Teague's words in mind and focus on how we can all walk away with not just hope and joy, but also some tactics about how we slow the machine down. Can we start with you, please, Teague?
New Mexico is a blue trifecta state. Both our governor, our state house, and our entirely congressional blue delegation. So in many ways, it is a state to invest in because the opportunity to innovate exists here. I want to lift up Shayna and her work at Acacia. They and their program represented, up until the Trump administration, a quarter of our budget in order to serve young immigrants who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected, or who are unaccompanied. The loss of that funding represents a significant shift to be able to represent immigrant youth in New Mexico. We are the only statewide provider of immigration legal services and have hundreds of children who our team represents. And because we live in this state and because we have the governor that we have and the Speaker of the House that we have, we were able to win an appropriation with their shepherding of $10 million for legal services for immigrants in our last session. And so those funds that we were dependent on from Acacia, we are now going to be able to use those funds to support and to continue to support those children, but also to scale up a legal infrastructure in all of New Mexico that is based in the community-based organizations that have the greatest trust with our immigrant communities across the state. One of the things that's beautiful about New Mexico, and many of you will hear later in the plenary with our base building organizations, it has been decades of organizing from groups like OLE, Somos, El Centro, and others that have changed the face of our legislature so that we were able to win this appropriation from our state house. And it's also that decades of organizing that means that we have systems in place to support immigrants in New Mexico now. And what does that look like? It looks like three things. We want to scale up our Know Your Rights and community education so that families can be prepared and start to get prepared now. Family preparedness is really about being able to make a decision about whether or not your family wants to enter into legal immigration proceedings. If they do, then we follow you down that path and into immigration court. If that's not the right choice for your family, then how do you begin to prepare to make sure that your children are going to be cared for in the case that you are separated for them? And that looks like guardianship and other custody arrangements so that trusted adults can care for your children when and if you're separated from them. And finally, there's some asset protection planning that you need to do. Who can help support the sale of your car, your home, or have access to your checking account? In New Mexico, immigrants have access to banking here so that you can make financial decisions if you make the decision to return to your country of origin, or if that decision happens through detention and deportation. We need to make those plans now, and we have a plan to do that here. We are launching, in the spirit of the movement that Shayna talked about, you'll find this on our website, a fellowship, one-year fellowship opportunities to bring attorneys and other legal workers to the border to fight for immigrant rights now. We need Freedom Summer now. And what can fellows do? To the point that I made earlier, they can help slow the machinery down. They can do the court observation projects. They can visit people in detention. They can connect people with their families, because very often individuals who are detained in New Mexico are coming from other parts of the country where you all are from. Those fellows can help people make decisions about whether they want to fight deportation or not. And then with our very strong core of immigration attorneys, we can place fellows in some of these very rural parts of the state so that they can work with the trusted community-based organizations that I mentioned earlier. What we need, though, is support from Philanthropy to maximize or boost that one-time state funding. Those funds cannot be used to support wellness for staff. They cannot be used to go back to the legislature to seek recurring funds. The state funds can also, it can be inflexible in the way that general operating philanthropic funds cannot be. The state has made a bet on New Mexico that we are going to do everything we can to fight for every immigrant that resides here, and we want to scale up an entire infrastructure because immigrant workers are invaluable to the future of New Mexico. We cannot afford in New Mexico to lose a single able-bodied worker. Our anchoring and throwing down for immigrants is about values for our economy as much as it is about administrative due process rights and rule of law. All of these tenets are connected, and organizing, base building, systemic advocacy, and legal services are the backbone of how we hold those systems up. Thank you.
Vanessa, what are you thinking in terms of slowing down the machine? Yeah?
No, me. Oh, me?
Vanessa?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, listen, I just have a short message on this. You know, I think philanthropy needs to fund the immigrant rights movement just across the board, period. I think it's been super clear the last few days, just a few weeks and few months, just how, again, the immigration is the tip of the spear, right? When our government is disappearing people, sending them to El Salvador prison, when people don't have access to lawyers so they can talk to their families, when we have US citizens being picked up in raids, when the government is taking away legality from folks like this administration has done, I think it shows very clearly that this administration is, again, violating fundamental rights, starting with the immigrant community. And I think, again, we can make the argument, because it is very clear, that this is not just an attack on immigrants. It's an attack on our fundamental freedoms and our fundamental values. That's the first thing. The other thing I want to underscore is that everyone now talks about how unprecedented this moment is, and it is. And I think that for the last 5+ years, there has been this call for people of color, and especially women of color, to step up to leadership positions. And now that we're facing this unprecedented moment, we're also having to fight for resources in our respective organizations. And many of us are also having to let go of staff. And I think there is that disconnect that is being felt not just across state and local organizations, but also around national organizations. So I think that's the other really important piece. So and then the last thing I want to say is that, you know, again, we have 7 million kids who are U.S. born, and one or both of their parents are undocumented. So when you think about how this repressive government is impacting our families, again, it is impacting all of us across the board. And we have to, again, I think, ask philanthropy to step up for us in this moment. because we are the future. we are the future. And the last point I will make is that, immigrants are essential to this country. We have always been part of the American story, and we are essential to our future prosperity. And that's also why I said earlier that in reclaiming our narrative, we have to tell that story, because that's actually a story based on truth and fact. One last point is that in terms of bringing people into our tent, we also have to meet them where they are. Some people might not speak the same language we do in terms of how they describe this issue, but we have to grow our tent. We cannot afford not to do that. And we have to meet them where they are, not just in terms of how we talk about this issue and how do we bring them into our tent, but also where they're getting their information. As you all know, the media landscape has changed very rapidly these last 5-10 years. And it's no longer enough to just talk to the TV or talk to print reporters. We now have to do a lot more work on social, and because that's actually where most of our folks are. So those will be some of the calls to action that I would give right now.
Lillian, what thoughts do you have for us?
I think, is this working? A little higher, here we go. I just want to speak a little bit about what I think a lot of our organizations are facing right now. For an organization like the Florence Project, it's been in Arizona for 35 years, where we're serving thousands and thousands of immigrants in detention, adults and children, and we've been doing this work every day. We are really at a critical moment. That is the truth. And that's the truth for a lot of the organizations that have been doing this work day in and day out. And what we're finding ourselves in is in a moment when our work is more critical than ever in terms of holding the line, in terms of standing firm, in terms of deploying our services and resources, in terms of creating infrastructure to meet new aspects of this moment. And at a critical time like this, while we are doing everything we can to hold the line, to provide our services, we also have to imagine what it could look like for an organization like us to exist in a post-federally funded world, and what it requires for an organization to do that type of restructure and pivot, and how to do that intentionally. And so part of the moment that a lot of our organizations are in is in a moment of having to understand ourselves in a new reality and understand how we sustain ourselves in this new reality while still meeting the critical needs on the ground through the services that are essential that we deploy right now. And so one of the things that's so important, I think, for organizations like ours right now is to receive the support of the philanthropic world in this moment of critical and intentional potential pivot that we are having to make. And what that can look like is emphasizing a couple of things. What does it look like for philanthropy right now to raise its voice? What does it look like for philanthropy right now to use the capital of its voice in this moment? And to also name what is important to philanthropy. What does it look like potentially right now for philanthropy to consider what we've all talked about for a very long time, which is having a mindset of abundance, where it's a both and not an either or, where we're looking at what's happening on the ground at a local level, and we're looking to support a local landscape at the same time that we're thinking and intentionally organizing around what it looks like to support a regional landscape, at the same time that we're thinking and strategizing as to what it looks like to support a national coordinated effort. And so what does it look like to sit with resources that can be deployed at different scales and also in a coordinated approach so that we can fill as many gaps as possible while we navigate this moment together? And what does it look like for us to lean into trust around that? And to understand the trust that needs to exist among legal services and other organizations and organizers and people doing the work right now, and reorient to a cause-driven approach to this that helps us all coordinate our resources and efforts for the whole. And what does it look like to potentially really lead with a sense of trust in terms of what's being asked of organizations that are already right now under critical pressure and being targets themselves, and doing the work of holding the line, and doing the work of filling the leadership gaps to organize around our own efforts and in coordination with others who are partners in this work. And to consider what it means to give emergency and critical funding, to consider what it could look like to give multi-year funding so that we can stabilize our own staffing and our own work over a longer period of time, and so that we can be here with you to continue to do this work, not just now, but into the future, and so that we can say we did it, and that we weren't planning for a death, but we were planning for our survival and our resurgence.
Thank you. Shayna, will you help round out the conversation? And then we will see if we have time for maybe one audience question.
Sure. So, in this moment, after the election, we were really anticipating the attacks. My organization has received federal funding and distributed it for, first at the Vera Institute. We are a spinoff of the Vera Institute of Justice, and then for the last 3.5 years as a standalone nonprofit organization. And in anticipation of what we knew was coming, which was a barrage of attacks on the federally funded legal aid infrastructure, and every single one of the programs that we run, depending on the posture of the litigation right now, is a subject of federal litigation in federal district courts. And we turned to our legal services community and said, what if we create something where we're able to mobilize resources together? And out of a series of conversations and really our pivot planning efforts, we created as a community the National Immigrant Legal Responders Alliance. And what that infrastructure is supposed to do is really meet the moment with a commitment to resilience. We know that our organizations are in really dire straits right now because of the attacks on legal aid and due process. But we're not going away, and that's our commitment to the communities that we protect. And so if you're a funder, we really ask that you support what already exists. We know that you cannot meet the amount of funding that the federal legal aid was providing, but we don't need that right now. What we need right now is to continue the federal litigation about these arbitrary defunding mechanisms, but at the same time, have flexible funds come into the legal services community that will allow us to continue the fight at the courthouses, in the detention centers. And when we pushed out the first tranche of NILRA funding that came in from some of the first philanthropic partners, the national partners that stepped up, we did an appeal to all 90 NILRA partners. We said, give us your proposals and what you need. And we were able to fund 10 of 63 applications that came in. But the total amount of funding that was requested by those 63 organizations was $10 million, which is not hard for philanthropy to meet. It's not the $300 million that we're being defunded for, but philanthropy can meet this moment. And as Lillian was saying, meet it not just with funding, but with relationship, with your voices. When you see an organization that you have been funding long-term being targeted in political attacks, step up and stand by that organization. Join us at the immigration courts. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. We're so sorry, folks. We are at time. But if folks have questions, please find our speakers afterwards. Thank you all, and let's give a big round for our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you for joining this session. The next plenary in this room is Plenary 5A, Rethinking Risk, Acting with Conviction When the Stakes Are High. In the Franciscan Ballroom, we will be hosting Plenary 5B, New Mexico Rising, how intersectional organizing turned the tide for democracy, dignity, and justice.